It's a chilly evening in the heart of the city, and Elena Moore, the determined FBI chief, is finishing a long and exhausting day at work. As she drives home through a quiet neighborhood, the usual hum of the city's night traffic fills the air. But this time, something feels different. Elena is no stranger to tension, but tonight it's palpable, an unsettling feeling that slowly creeps in as she notices the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A police officer, marked by his uniform and stern demeanor, signals her to pull over. At first, she thinks it's just routine, a simple stop that would be over in a matter of minutes. However, this stop will change the course of her evening, and perhaps her entire life. The officer, Jason Hunt, approaches her car with an air of authority, his gaze cold and unyielding. Elena, ever composed and experienced, immediately reaches for her ID. She knows the drill: maintain calm, provide necessary documents, and ensure the interaction is brief. But Hunt doesn't ask for her license or registration. Instead, he starts with an unexpected question: "What are you doing here?" Elena's brows furrow in confusion. The neighborhood is a well-known area of the city, but Hunt's tone suggests she doesn't belong. In a few seconds, the calm night turns into something much more hostile. The officer continues his questioning, his words laced with suspicion, and his behavior increasingly invasive. Elena feels a wave of frustration rising inside her. Is it her job? Her race? Her very presence that makes this officer question her? She remains calm, trying to defuse the tension, but the situation is rapidly spiraling. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated with the next thrilling chapter. Let's see how Elena navigates the escalating confrontation and what happens next. Elena's grip tightened on the steering wheel as Officer Jason Hunt's words echoed in her mind. "What are you doing here?" It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. In the split second that followed, Elena processed his tone, his stance, and the way he approached her vehicle. His uniform was crisp, the kind of detail an officer like him would take pride in, but there was something more to it, something off about the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, as though she didn't belong. She had been pulled over countless times in her career as an FBI chief, but nothing like this. She had dealt with routine stops, minor traffic violations, and the occasional suspicious activity, but this felt different. The sharpness in his eyes was unsettling. Elena had to remind herself to stay calm. Her mind raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Officer, is there a problem?" Hunt didn't immediately respond. Instead, he peered into her car, his eyes scanning the interior as if searching for something that wasn't there. Elena noticed his gaze lingered for a moment on the badge clipped to her belt, a badge she always carried, visible but not for show. It was a reminder of her position, her power. But in this moment, it felt like it meant nothing. The officer leaned closer to the window, his breath fogging up the glass. "I'm asking you again, what are you doing here?" Elena's pulse quickened. She had lived in this city for years, driven down this very street countless times. There was nothing strange about her presence here. She had no reason to feel uncomfortable. And yet, the air between them was thick with an unspoken tension. "I'm heading home, officer. It's been a long day, and I'm just trying to get some rest." Elena kept her tone calm, trying to defuse whatever animosity he was projecting. The last thing she needed was to escalate the situation. The officer didn't seem satisfied with her answer. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You're the FBI chief, right? Elena Moore?" His voice had a hard edge now, as though her identity had shifted from something neutral to something more complicated in his eyes. Elena's stomach twisted, but she remained composed. "Yes, that's correct," she said, her voice measured but firm. The officer took a step back, still not looking entirely convinced. Elena watched as he made a mental note of something, perhaps her demeanor, perhaps the way she responded, or maybe it was something else. His eyes flickered to the back seat, where her briefcase Saturday, a hint of suspicion behind his gaze. She couldn't help but wonder if his suspicion was rooted in her profession. Was he questioning her integrity? Or was it something more? "Do you mind if I search your car?" The question was sudden, and Elena felt a chill run through her. A routine stop had taken a strange, unnerving turn. No, I don't consent to a search. Elena's voice was steady, but her mind was racing. The power dynamic had shifted, and she wasn't about to let him overstep his bounds. She was still a citizen, regardless of her title, and she knew the law. Hunt's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena feared the situation might escalate into something more dangerous. He seemed to weigh his options, his eyes never leaving hers. The pause stretched longer than it should have. An unspoken battle of wills between them. "What's in the briefcase?" Hunt finally asked, his eyes flicking toward the back seat again. Elena's heart skipped. She had been so careful. Everything in that case was classified. Sensitive information she was legally obligated to protect. Her job as the FBI chief often put her in situations where her trust was tested, but this felt like an entirely different kind of violation. Still, she held her ground. "I'm not going to answer that," Elena said firmly. "If you have a reason to suspect something, then you need to call for a supervisor. Otherwise, I'm leaving." Hunt studied her for a moment longer, and then, without saying another word, he took a step back. Elena watched as his hand hovered over his radio for a second, a move that made her body tense, waiting for his next action. She had no idea what was running through his mind, but the power in his hands was real. If he wanted to escalate things, he could. He could make her night even longer. But he also knew that pushing her too far might come with consequences. The air between them was heavy. Elena could feel the weight of his unspoken judgment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it break her composure. She was used to standing tall in the face of adversity, and she wasn't about to let this officer dictate how the night would unfold. After a tense silence, Hunt finally spoke again. "You're free to go." Elena didn't say anything, but she gave him a sharp nod before putting the car in drive. As she pulled away from the curb, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't over. There was something about the way he had looked at her, the questions he had asked. Something wasn't right. This officer had treated her like a suspect, and that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. It felt like a warning, like the city she had served for so long had shifted, and she was no longer seen as the protector, but as the one who needed to prove her worth. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his flashing lights behind her again. But there was nothing, just the empty street stretching out before her, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement, and the feeling that she had just brushed against something much darker than a routine traffic stop. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't an accident. Something told her this was just the beginning of a much bigger mystery. The streets felt emptier than usual as Elena continued to drive. The darkened alleys and quiet intersections seemed to press in on her, amplifying the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in her gut. She had tried to shake off the encounter with Officer Hunt, but the more she thought about it, the more the events seemed off. It wasn't just the interrogation, it was the way he had looked at her, the way his questions had become more pointed, more probing. A sense of suspicion had hung in the air, thick and suffocating. As an FBI chief, Elena had spent years reading people, understanding their motives with a practiced eye, but Hunt's demeanor, his sudden intensity, left her with an unsettling sense that there was something far bigger at play. Elena shook her head and tried to focus on the road ahead, the hum of the engine beneath her providing a small sense of normalcy. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was an old instinct, one she had honed over years of facing threats, always being aware of your surroundings, of the subtle shifts in the environment. Tonight, the shift was palpable, and it wasn't just the officer's unsettling presence. Something else was lurking just beyond her vision. She made a sharp turn, her tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement, and her eyes narrowed as she noticed a dark figure in the distance, a silhouette under the flickering streetlight. The figure appeared to be standing still, watching her. Elena's instincts kicked in, and she slowed the car, peering through the windshield. It was hard to make out details from this distance, but the figure stood rigid, unmoving, as if waiting for something, or someone. A chill ran through her. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she scanned the area, but there was no other movement. The figure remained stationary, eerily calm. She didn't recognize the person, but that didn't mean much. Elena had seen her share of shady characters during her time in the FBI, and while she was trained to keep a level head, this felt different. This wasn't just a random encounter. The tension in the air was too thick to ignore. Her heart rate quickened as she debated her next move. Should she stop and investigate, or continue driving? A deep part of her, the part that had been honed in the field, urged her to pull over and confront the situation head-on. But the other part, the rational part, told her to keep moving. She couldn't afford to be sidetracked by this figure in the dark. She had a job to do, and whatever was happening tonight, she needed to stay focused. Just as she made up her mind to drive past, the figure shifted, too quickly, too suddenly. Before Elena could react, the person stepped into her path, blocking her car's route. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no way she could avoid hitting them without swerving into oncoming traffic. And instinctively, she slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt just inches from the figure, the tires skidding over the wet pavement with an unsettling squeal. For a moment, there was silence. The figure remained motionless, and Elena's heart thudded in her chest, her mind racing through potential scenarios. Had she just narrowly avoided a dangerous encounter? Was this a trap? A setup? The figure didn't move. Elena's hand hovered over the door handle, but she didn't open it. Her mind was already at work, analyzing the situation. Was this a test? Another part of some larger plan? She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to the night than met the eye. "Is everything okay?" she called out, her voice steady, though her pulse quickened. Her instincts told her to stay alert. If this was some kind of ambush, she wasn't going to be caught off guard. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they took a slow, deliberate step closer to the car, and Elena's eyes locked onto their face. The streetlight above cast a faint glow, illuminating their features. But it wasn't enough to offer any clarity. The person was wearing a hood, their face hidden in shadows, only their eyes visible, a pair of cold, calculating eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Elena could feel the tension rising in her chest. Who was this? And why were they here? Finally, the figure spoke, their voice low and almost eerily calm. "I need you to listen carefully. Elena Moore, you're in danger." Elena's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Danger? What kind of danger? Who was this person? And how did they know her name? Her mind spun, analyzing every possibility. She was no stranger to threats, had dealt with more than her fair share in her time with the FBI. But this felt different. There was something chillingly personal about the way the figure spoke, something that suggested they knew her better than they should. A knot formed in the pit of her stomach. "I don't have time for games," Elena replied, her voice sharp. "Who are you? And why are you threatening me?" The figure tilted their head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, without warning, they reached into their jacket pocket and pulled out a small object, tossing it onto the hood of her car. Elena's eyes flickered to the object, but before she could react, the figure had already backed away into the shadows, vanishing just as suddenly as they had appeared. She stared at the object on the hood, an envelope, its edges rough, the paper worn as though it had been handled by multiple people. Without thinking, Elena grabbed it and tore it open. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper with a short, cryptic message. "They know everything. Trust no one, not even the ones closest to you." Elena's heart skipped a beat as the weight of the words hit her. She glanced around, but the figure was gone. The street was empty again, as if nothing had happened. But the message burned in her mind. This wasn't a warning, it was a signal. Someone was watching, and they were closer than she realized. As the night grew colder, Elena knew that she couldn't ignore this. The tension in the air was no longer just a feeling, it was a reality, and it was only going to escalate from here. Elena stared at the message, the words searing into her mind. They know everything. Trust no one. The paper felt heavy, despite the faint chill in the air. Her heart pounded as she tried to process what this could mean. Who was behind this cryptic warning? And why her? The figure in the shadows had been the first clue. They had appeared suddenly, offering nothing but a cryptic message that only raised more questions. Elena's instincts, honed over years of working in law enforcement, screamed that there was more to this than met the eye. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone was watching her, tracking her every move. Her mind raced back to her earlier years at the FBI. She had joined with a sense of idealism, determined to bring justice to the criminal world. But over time, she had come to see the flaws in the system. It wasn't just the criminals who exploited the law, it was those in power, too. The corruption was everywhere, even within the very institution she had trusted. She thought about the cases she had worked on, high-profile individuals who had gotten away with heinous acts because of their connections. Their money, the system, which she had believed in, was flawed. The truth had been buried time and again, swept aside by those who could afford to keep it hidden. But now, the message in her hands threatened to expose more than just the criminals she had already confronted. Someone had been following her, someone who knew far more than they should. Her every move had been tracked, her every decision observed. It felt as if she was no longer just fighting criminals, but the very system that had promised to protect her. Her phone rang, breaking her train of thought. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something told her to answer. Elena Moore, a voice on the other end said, smooth and cold. You've been digging too deep. Elena's stomach churned. Who is this? She demanded, her voice sharp. We know everything. Elena, the voice continued, you think you're in control, but you're just a pawn in a game far bigger than you realize. Her pulse quickened, but she wasn't going to back down. I've seen your kind before. I'm not afraid. The voice chuckled darkly. It's not about fear. It's about understanding. You think you're the hero, but you're just playing into our hands. The line went dead. Elena sat in silence, her heart racing. Had she become part of a system she once believed in? Was she just another player in a game of injustice that had been going on long before she got involved? She knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. Elena sat at her desk, the soft glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The message, the cryptic warning, lingered in her mind like an unsettling echo. The phone call had only confirmed what she feared. She was caught in the crosshairs of something far bigger than she had ever anticipated. She had always prided herself on being ahead of the curve, on understanding the motives behind every case she worked on. But this was different. She had to act fast, but she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The first step was clear: gather information. Whoever was behind the warning knew her past, her methods. But what did they want? What did they hope to gain by threatening her? The files on her desk seemed like a blur, a tangled web of cases and names that she had worked on over the years. Her mind started to piece things together, linking people, events, and clues that hadn't made sense at the time. She had investigated high-profile criminal cases, exposing corrupt figures. But had she overlooked something? Was there a connection between those she had investigated and this looming threat? Her eyes landed on a specific file, an old case she had worked on during her early days in the FBI. It involved a wealthy businessman with ties to powerful politicians, a man who had escaped justice despite overwhelming evidence of his crimes. The case had been closed quickly, swept under the rug by those in power, and she had been forced to walk away. She remembered the whispers, the rumors about the real power behind the throne. Had she missed something? Had this case never truly been resolved? She pulled the file from the stack, carefully going through each page. The businessman, Gregory Harlan, had always been a figure of mystery. His wealth, his influence, his connections, everything about him seemed to scream corruption. But there had always been something that didn't add up. Elena had spent months trying to break down his empire, but every time she got close, someone intervened. The investigation was shut down, the evidence buried, and Elena was left with nothing but questions. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. A message from an unknown number. She hesitated, but curiosity got the best of her. We know what you're looking for. Stop digging. It was a warning, clear and simple. Whoever had sent it was watching her, and they were aware of her every move. Elena leaned back in her chair, the weight of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about Harlan anymore. This was about the network that protected him, a network that had somehow stayed hidden for all these years. If she wanted to survive, she had to expose it. But she couldn't do it alone. She reached for her phone and made the call. She needed someone she could trust, someone with the skills to help her navigate the dangerous waters she was about to dive into. Hey, it's Elena. I need your help. This isn't just another case. I'm being targeted, and I need someone who can help me find out who's behind this. You in? The voice on the other end paused for a moment before responding. I'm in. What's the plan? Elena's lips tightened as she looked at the files again. The first part of the plan was to get Harlan under surveillance. The second was to dig deeper into the network he was part of, to follow the trail and see where it led. She needed to move quickly, but she also needed to be careful. Every move she made now was crucial. Let's get started, Elena said, determination settling in. The investigation had begun, and there was no turning back. Elena's hands hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing through the tangled web of leads and dead ends. The case was growing more complex by the day, and the deeper she dug, the more the walls seemed to close in around her. She had expected some resistance. Every major case had its hurdles, but this was different. This wasn't just a case of corruption. It was a fight for survival. The initial steps had been slow, methodical. She had reconnected with old colleagues, accessed archived materials, and even tracked down a few of Harlan's former associates. But the more she learned, the more she realized how far-reaching this network went. Harlan wasn't just a businessman. He was a key player in a shadowy organization that had its hands in everything, from politics to organized crime. And the more she uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Every time she thought she had a breakthrough, something went wrong. A document would go missing, a source would go silent, or worse, a new threat would emerge. Her phone would buzz in the dead of night, a chilling message from an anonymous number warning her to stop. The threats were escalating, and Elena could feel the weight of them bearing down on her. It was a quiet afternoon when the first unexpected turn happened. Elena had just left a meeting with a contact at a local tech company, someone who might have had access to incriminating emails between Harlan and certain political figures. She had barely stepped into her car when she received an alert. Surveillance footage. Harlan's meeting. It was an encrypted video file, sent to her through a secure channel. Her heart raced as she opened the file, the grainy footage flickering to life on her phone. There, in a dimly lit room, was Gregory Harlan, sitting across from a group of men she didn't recognize. They were speaking in hushed tones, their words inaudible, but their body language was unmistakable. They were planning something big. Elena paused the video, replaying the scene over and over again, trying to make sense of the fragmented image. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her partner, Jake. Elena, something's not right. I've been following up on one of the leads you gave me, and I think I found something that might be connected to your case. But it's bigger than we thought. Call me. A chill ran down Elena's spine. She had a sinking feeling that whatever Jake had uncovered, it was going to make her already dangerous situation even worse. She didn't waste time. She called him immediately, her mind racing with possibilities. Jake, what's going on? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Elena, I don't know how to say this, but I think we're dealing with something far more complicated than just corruption. The trail I was following, it leads to people we never expected to be involved, Jake said, his voice tight with anxiety. I'm sending you everything I've got, but you need to be careful. Whoever is behind this is watching us. I'm not sure who to trust anymore. Elena's stomach churned. This was the moment she had feared. The moment when the investigation would cross a line into dangerous territory. She couldn't back down now, though, not after everything she had uncovered. She hung up the phone and sat back in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Who was behind this organization? What were they planning? And most importantly, who could she trust? Before she could formulate a plan, a figure appeared in the rearview mirror. Elena's heart skipped a beat. A black SUV had pulled up behind her, its headlights shining in her eyes, blinding her momentarily. Her mind raced. Was this just a coincidence? Or had they found her? She didn't wait to find out. Without a second thought, she started the engine and sped off, weaving through the streets as quickly as she could. The SUV followed, tailing her closely. Elena's pulse quickened, every instinct telling her that she was being hunted. She knew she had to lose them, but the thought of what would happen if they caught up to her made her stomach twist. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from an unknown number. "You're not safe. Elena, stop digging, or we'll make sure you regret it." Elena gripped the steering wheel tighter, her thoughts sharp and focused. The investigation had just taken a dangerous turn. Whoever was watching her was willing to go to any lengths to stop her. She wasn't going to back down, but she knew now that the stakes were higher than ever. As she navigated the dark streets, her mind raced through the next steps of the plan. She had to find out what Harlan was planning, and fast. But first, she had to survive long enough to get the answers she needed. And with every second that passed, Elena knew one thing for sure. She was deeper in this than she had ever intended to be. Elena's mind was reeling. The threats, the surveillance, the cryptic messages, they were all pointing in one terrifying direction. As much as she had tried to keep a professional distance, the deeper she got into the investigation, the more personal it became. The stakes weren't just about uncovering corruption anymore. They were about exposing a hidden network that had been operating under the radar for years. And it wasn't just any network, it was a dangerous one, with people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. She sat in her small office, the only light coming from the glow of her laptop screen. The encrypted files Jake had sent her earlier were now open in front of her. She had barely had time to go through the documents before the SUV had started tailing her. But now, in the safety of her office, she could focus. The files were disjointed at first glance, but as she combed through them, patterns began to emerge. There were names, dates, transactions, and locations, each one tied to Gregory Harlan and several key figures in the political and business world. But what truly caught her attention was the final document in the chain, a list of accounts, all linked to offshore trusts. The names on the list weren't just political elites or business moguls. They were people she had once considered her allies. Some were former colleagues from her time in law enforcement. Others were journalists she had worked alongside in the past. But now, they were listed alongside Harlan, implicating them in something much larger than anyone had suspected. Elena's stomach twisted as she realized the full scope of the web she had unwittingly stepped into. These weren't just criminals, they were the puppeteers, pulling the strings behind the scenes. But as her eyes scanned the final entry, her blood ran cold. There, at the bottom of the list, was her name. Not just her name, but a reference to a meeting she had attended several months ago. A meeting that had seemed innocuous at the time. Nothing more than a casual discussion about investigative methods and sources. But now, it seemed to be part of something far darker. Her presence at that meeting had been noted, and it was clear that someone had been watching her long before she realized the danger. It was then that Elena understood the magnitude of what she was up against. The people involved in this conspiracy had eyes everywhere. They had infiltrated not only government agencies and corporations, but also independent journalists and private investigators. And now, it seemed, they had infiltrated her too. Elena leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The truth was more than she had ever expected. This wasn't just about one man or one corrupt corporation. It was about an entire system, one that had been operating under the radar for decades, slowly tightening its grip on society. If she wanted to bring it down, she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, and she needed a plan. She thought about Jake. The last conversation they'd had been cryptic, and now, more than ever, she realized how crucial his information could be. He had been following leads that she hadn't even known about, and if anyone could help her piece together the full picture, it was him. But Elena couldn't afford to trust anyone blindly, not anymore. The fact that her name had appeared in those files meant that even her closest allies could be compromised. She had to tread carefully. The next few days passed in a blur. Elena spent every waking hour digging deeper into the files, reaching out to sources she had kept hidden in the shadows, trying to track down every last lead. She knew she was being watched, but she couldn't afford to stop. Every piece of evidence she uncovered only made the conspiracy seem more vast, more insidious. There were links to illegal arms deals, money laundering, and even human trafficking. Each revelation made her more determined to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Then, on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, Elena received a call from Jake. His voice was barely audible over the noise of the storm, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. "Elena, you need to listen to me," he said, his voice shaking. "I've found something, something that connects all the dots, but I'm not sure how much time I have. They're coming for me." The words sent a chill down Elena's spine. She knew Jake wasn't one to panic, and if he was afraid, it meant that something terrible was about to happen. She told him to meet her at their usual spot, an old diner on the outskirts of town that they'd used as a safe house in the past. When Elena arrived, she found Jake sitting at a corner booth, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Jake, what's going on?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from him. "I've been following up on that meeting you were at, the one they have on record," he said, his voice low. "I think I found the final piece of the puzzle, but it's worse than we thought. Harlan's not just using political figures to shield himself. He's working with a network of private military contractors, people with connections to rogue intelligence agencies, mercenaries. He's building an army, Elena, and once he's finished, he'll have the power to control not just the city, but the entire region." Elena felt her blood run cold. It all made sense now, the sudden influx of money, the strange military-grade equipment she had traced back to one of Harlan's shell companies. This wasn't just about corruption. This was a power grab on a scale she couldn't even comprehend. Jake slid a folder across the table. "This is everything I've found. It's not just about money anymore. Harlan's got something much bigger in the works, and it involves people we never suspected. I think they're planning something massive. Elena, you need to move fast." Elena looked at the folder, her heart pounding. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. The truth had finally been unveiled. But now, with the full scope of the conspiracy in front of her, the real challenge began. The forces arrayed against her were more powerful than anything she had ever faced, and the danger was only beginning. With a steady breath, Elena nodded. "Let's finish this." Elena gripped the steering wheel, her hands trembling. The evidence Jake had handed her felt like a ticking time bomb. It was no longer just about exposing corruption. It was about survival. The network she had uncovered was vast, and the forces behind it were ruthless. Harlan's empire wasn't built on just power and money. It was built on fear. Fear of exposure. And Elena had just walked into its heart. Her phone buzzed. It was Jake. "They know. They're watching me." Her heart raced. Fear filled his message, and she knew time was running out. Jake had been her ally, but now he, too, was in danger. The web of corruption was closing in, and they were both at risk. The system was broken. Police, government, even the media. They were all part of it. Only she remained, the lone journalist who dared challenge the conspiracy. She couldn't waste time. Elena quickly pulled out of the parking lot and drove to their meeting spot. Her mind raced, thinking of her next steps. She had the evidence, names, dates, connections. But what good was it if no one would believe her? She couldn't trust the authorities. They were all compromised. If Elena was going to expose the truth, she'd have to do it herself, or with the help of the few she could still trust. At the diner, Jake sat at their usual booth, pale and exhausted. His eyes darted around the room, nervous. Elena slid into the seat across from him, locking eyes with him. He looked worse than before. "What did you find?" Elena asked. Jake hesitated, then spoke in a whisper. "Harlan's network. It's worse than we thought. It's not just corruption. He's working with a private army, mercenaries tied to rogue intelligence agencies. They're planning something big, something that could destabilize entire governments. They're not just controlling the city, they're building an empire. And they'll do anything to protect it." Elena's heart sank. This wasn't just about exposing a businessman. It was about stopping a global conspiracy. The stakes had never been higher. "How do we stop them?" she asked. Jake looked grim. "I don't know, but we need to be careful. They have resources. If we make a wrong move, we could disappear." Elena nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They needed to act fast, but also carefully. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. I'll get the evidence out there, she said, determination in her voice. I have contacts in the media. We'll leak it, and once it's out, they won't be able to stop us. Jake looked doubtful. Do you really think they'll believe you? Harlan has people everywhere. I don't care. Elena replied firmly. We have to try. If we don't expose him now, it'll be too late. Jake didn't argue. They knew it was their only chance. The next few days were a blur. Elena reached out to her trusted media contacts, sharing everything anonymously. Every step was calculated. Meanwhile, Jake kept digging, uncovering more about Harlan's mercenaries. The deeper they went, the more dangerous things became. Then, Elena got a call. One of her media contacts. It's happening. We go live in 48 hours, the voice said. Elena's heart raced. The evidence was about to be exposed to the world. But just as she felt a glimmer of hope, the line went dead. Her stomach dropped. Something was wrong. She immediately grabbed her things and rushed to meet Jake. As she stepped outside, she saw it. A black SUV parked across the street. Her blood ran cold. The people she was up against were coming for her. They weren't going to stop until she was silenced. The struggle for justice had just begun, and the cost was higher than Elena had ever imagined. Elena stared at the computer screen, her hands trembling as she typed the final words. She had been working for days, preparing the ultimate expose that would bring down the empire Harlan had built. The evidence was irrefutable: corruption at the highest levels, a network of mercenaries, secret dealings with foreign governments, and the manipulation of the media. Everything she had uncovered was now laid out, ready to be unleashed. But as she clicked send on the encrypted email, a cold, sinking feeling washed over her. Was she ready for the storm that would follow? The days leading up to this moment had been filled with fear, doubt, and a sense of constant surveillance. Harlan's people were everywhere. Her phone was tapped, her emails monitored, and the once safe places she visited became tainted by the feeling that she was always being watched. Elena had grown used to living in the shadows, but this final step would expose everything. It was no longer about just her. Jake, her closest ally, was now deeply involved, and the risks had only escalated. Are you sure about this? Jake had asked just hours before. His voice was filled with concern, not fear, but something deeper, something Elena couldn't quite place. I don't have a choice, she had replied. If I don't do this, it will be too late for all of us. Jake had nodded, but the anxiety in his eyes lingered. I just want you to be safe. I know what these people are capable of. Elena looked out the window now, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. It wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about protecting everything she believed in. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. But could she survive this battle? The phone buzzed again, breaking her thoughts. A message from an anonymous contact flashed on the screen. They know. Prepare yourself. The words hit like a slap to the face. How much longer did she have before everything unraveled? Just as she was about to call Jake, a knock on the door startled her. She froze. The suddenness of the sound sent a wave of panic through her. She had no time for visitors, not now. It could be Harlan's people. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing, but her instinct screamed that something was wrong. Elena's breath quickened as she slowly backed away from the door, scanning the room for anything out of place. Then, the phone rang. Elena hesitated for a second, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed the phone. It was Jake. They're here, he said, his voice tight with urgency. They know. They're coming for you. Before Elena could respond, the line went dead. Without thinking, she grabbed her laptop and everything she needed to leave. She rushed to the back door and, with her heart hammering in her chest, slipped out into the alley. The night air was cold, but it did little to calm her nerves. Every step felt like it could be her last. Jake had warned her. Harlan's reach was vast, and his network was deadly. But what could she do now? The evidence was out. There was no turning back. Elena moved quickly through the back streets, her thoughts racing. She couldn't go back to her apartment. It was compromised. But she knew there was one place she could go: Jake's safe house. It was a small, hidden space where they had once planned their strategy. If anyone could protect her now, It was him. As she approached the safe house, her phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a notification from a news outlet. The expose was live. Elena's heart skipped a beat. The world was finally learning the truth about Harlan's empire. She had done it. But then, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a call from Jake. His voice was ragged, desperate. "Elena, listen to me. You need to leave. It's not safe here. They found me." Before she could ask what was happening, there was a sound in the background, screams, the sound of rushing footsteps, and then the phone went dead. Panic surged through Elena's veins. She had to act fast. Her mind raced as she pushed forward, praying she wasn't too late to save Jake. This was no longer just a fight for the truth. It was a fight for survival. The world was watching, but there was no guarantee she or Jake would make it out alive. They had taken on the most dangerous forces in the world, and now, the endgame was upon them. In that moment, Elena realized that justice, real justice, wasn't something that could be handed to you. It was something you fought for, even when it seemed impossible, even when the odds were stacked against you. And she wasn't going to stop, not now, not ever. The struggle for justice was about to reach its peak. The air was thick with tension as Elena sat alone in the darkened room. The weight of everything she had fought for pressing heavily on her shoulders. The journey had been long, filled with moments of doubt, fear, and loss. She had seen the worst of humanity, the corruption, the betrayal, the abuse of power, and yet, through it all, she had persevered. The truth had been exposed, but the battle was far from over. Justice had not been fully served, and the price for it had been high. Jake was gone. The safe house had been compromised, and despite her best efforts, Elena had failed to save him. The one person who had stood by her side through every danger, every turn, was lost to the same people they had tried to take down. His sacrifice weighed heavily on her heart. She knew the path they had chosen was never one without risk, but the pain of his loss was something she could never fully reconcile. But even in the face of personal grief, Elena had found clarity. The mission was never about one person. It was about the larger fight for truth and justice. She had uncovered the depths of Harlan's empire, exposed the lies that had kept it alive, and brought the corruption to light. The world knew now. The evidence was irrefutable. The people involved would no longer be able to hide in the shadows. The road to justice had always been more complicated than she had imagined. There had been moments when it felt as though the forces against her were too powerful to overcome, when the weight of the system felt insurmountable. But in the end, it wasn't just the truth that mattered. It was the unwavering commitment to fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. As Elena looked out the window at the city below, she understood that the struggle wasn't over. The world would continue to turn, and new battles would rise in the wake of the ones already fought. There would be others who would try to exploit the system, who would try to bury the truth again. But Elena knew now more than ever that one person, no matter how small or insignificant they seemed, could make a difference. She had done it, and she wouldn't stop. Her work wasn't finished. The fight for justice was never truly over. It was an ongoing process, a relentless pursuit of truth that required sacrifices, persistence, and resilience. Though she had lost so much, she had gained something that could never be taken away: the knowledge that the truth had been uncovered, and that it was a powerful force in its own right. Elena didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she would continue to fight, not for glory, not for recognition, but for the people who could not speak for themselves. The battle was never just about her. It was about everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had suffered at the hands of the powerful. She had uncovered their stories, and in doing so, she had become their voice. As she walked away from the remnants of everything she had fought for, Elena carried with her a sense of purpose that would never fade. The journey had been difficult, the losses immense, but the truth had been unveiled, and that was something no one could ever take away from her. The fight for justice was not over. It was just beginning.